Judaism born divided, how we got here. So if you are here today, and I'm looking at some of your faces, you might be familiar already with Below the Bible Belt, the course that I have led for 3.5 years, with many of you along for the ride, examining how we got here. What are the building blocks of the literacy of the biblical text and how that got us to today's reality? Jewish, Christian, Muslim, other, all of the above, none of the above. We are products of this book that was constructed over hundreds and really thousands of years, and it still is on some levels being constructed. Below the Bible Belt, that lasted 3.5 years, was my first time reading through the entire Hebrew Bible, and a lot of questions came up and a lot of discoveries. Reverend Derrick McQueen, at whose church we are sitting today, we just had a beautiful church service where Derrick and I led, and I was honored to lead the sermon, following up on the beautiful sermon that Derrick led on Friday evening at Lab Shul, at our Sabbath Queen. And this is as part of our joint, not only preacher swap, but community together in honor of the weekend that holds the legacy of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King alive in our memory, in our legacy, in our commitment to working together towards justice in all the ways we can. So because I was already here today at this beautiful church that you can see around us and had the honor of delivering the sermon, we thought it would be wonderful to do the kickoff of 12 sessions online and many other essays in the middle here at church, linking the prophecies and the messages of Dr. King to some of the biblical messages that we will begin looking at today. And the big question here is really, how did we get to be where we are today? So this man and I are fortunate to be in solidarity. It's not obvious that a Christian and a Jew, a man of African-American descent and a Euro-Jewish mutt like me would be together in a house of worship, focusing on our shared legacy, not on what differentiates us. And yet we are one of many duos and groups and teams and people who are thinking about what we have in common, not only what divides us. And what I'm hoping this year-long course will allow us to do is focus on understanding how we got to the place of such deep divisions in this country, the political, religious divides, the religiously motivated values that are pitting people against each other as we speak in this country and has been for centuries. I'm coming to this from the point of view of an Israeli American, looking at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the intra-Jewish conflict. How could it be that at the same moment we have such different ideologies informing what does it mean to be a Jew today? From the most utter right to the utter left, from all the ways in which particular and universal, liberal and literal, Zionist, diasporist, etc., how are we so split? So what we have today is an opportunity to think a little bit about the vision of Dr. King, who was informed by the wisdom of the prophetic words of Amos the prophet. We're going to invite our own prophetic friend here to start off by framing this teaching of Dr. King and the prophet Amos. And then I'm going to go deeper into who Amos was. What is it that this prophetic text is teaching us about our history, how the division brings us to this moment. We're going to, from there, look at one more prophetess in our history. And this, again, is just an invitation for us to think together about what it means to be products of a culture that was born divided and that many of us did not know about. As I read through the Hebrew Bible, through all those months, the war in Israel and Palestine erupted. October 7th came on the heels of the judicial reform protest, and the chapters through the Bible kept showing up as an eerie link between past and present, between all the voices of discord. And that made these questions a lot more harsh. And so Judaism Born Divided, How We Got Here, is going to be a year-long exploration of the northern kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah, that coexisted for hundreds of years, that created different regal dynasties, different prophetic schools of thought, different ways of being in the world that are lesser known today. And I think if we know those two ideologies and those histories, we'll understand more about how we got here today and how our different voices are legitimate and authentic in their differences. So the dignity of difference is what we're going to get to, and how we build bridges and common ground despite deep differences. We're going to go to the history to be in the present and forge a path to the future. That's the plan. So thank you, first of all, for being here. I apologize again for the beginning, but I'm hoping we're here now in good spirit and with good sound and with good everything you need. I'm going to turn it off to my friend Reverend Derrick to help us with the first few texts that are in your study sheets. We are going to spotlight.
I got it.
You got it? Okay, amen. And I just want to say in the opening message, and I'm going to, in the chat, I already put a link to this study sheet that is on the landing page. I'm going to put it again here in just a moment for you to use. These are going to be the texts that we'll be using. This will all be sent to you also after today's course, including the recording of this of the session. So we'll have the archive for every single one of these resources. Reverend Derrick, take it away.
Thank you so much. And thank you for, calling me together and to be here with you in this conversation. I was letting Rabbi Amichai know that in our Christian tradition, it's very rare that I get to really delve in with people to understand about the two nations being under one and being so divisive and all of that happening. But yet it is at the core of many of our lectionary texts. The lectionary texts are the prescribed scriptures that we have each Sunday for every 3 years, A, B, and C. And this particular year has been very, very, very powerful because it's been talking a lot about what is happening between the two kingdoms and the division and what is happening with that and how that led to some of our Christian ideologies and theologies about where we are and how it's being misused and how it's being misinterpreted now. So this is really powerful for me to be able to be a part of this conversation, especially when I'm thinking about this from Dr. King's point of view. And because you don't know this, but when I wrote my thesis for my Master's of Divinity, I wrote a piece called Jacob and Esau. And I thought it was Esau and Jacob compared to Malcolm and Martin, two brothers born of the same womb. Martin and Malcolm were actually born, both of their parents were in the black church, were leaders in the black church, and yet they came out vastly different. And it took so much for them to even be able to be in that one photograph. We only have one photograph of them in the same space together. And that's a very powerful coming together and talking about being divided and coming together. But I think what I love about what we're talking about and what we're talking about with King is that King, I think he really loved Amos specifically because of what we mentioned today in the service and what I mentioned on Friday evening is that the country and the people and our religiosity and our way of being people, we feel real comfortable. And we feel real comfortable with our privilege. We feel real comfortable with our comfortability with the things that are offered to us and that we have access to, so that we have the option to ignore injustice. We have the option to ignore oppression. We have the options to do these things as often as we like. And what King did and what Amos did is that they recognized that into this comfortability, you have to stand firm with the discomfort and you have to speak the truth. And you speak the truth to that. And it was actually the people's reaction to the truth about what was uncomfortable that moved the civil rights movement along. It was the videotape. It was the filming of the hoses on children. It was watching weeping people cry coming out of a church in Alabama. It was watching, Emmett Till's funeral and seeing people and seeing his face plastered all over the newspapers, whereas before all of that was hidden. And Amos had a way of really bringing that kind of truth out to people. And King felt resonance, I believe, with that. And we have this song in our tradition called Wade in the Water. And wade in the water, children, wade in the water, because the waters are going to be troubled by the divine. So when I read, it's time for justice to roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream, and knowing that King didn't wade in the water, but he stood in the prophetic stream, insisting that a nation that tramples the poor and hoards the privilege will face judgment unless it changes its policies and practices. That wade in the water, that spiritual, that calls us to remember that the waters are going to be stirred no matter how comfortable you get when there's oppression and when there's injustice. That King stood in that, and he didn't try to get from one side to the other. He stood in the middle of that stream, ready to make the pronouncements of what he needed to make forward with that. And I think that that's when Linda Thomas talks about this, that she's really thinking about his affinity with understanding what it means to be in that liminal space, but to know that the waters are moving around you and through you, and that you have the responsibility to call attention to, we must be in the stream so that we can be even washed by righteousness as it's flowing through us and going down to where we're speaking.
So I just want to let you know, folks, the link in the chat will take you to the PDF that has the sources for today. We have some copies here in person for those in the room. And we're going to start with source number 1 from Reverend Dr. Linda Thomas.
Right.
You just quoted. You want to perhaps lead it to us? And there's another one.
So this quote, this source number 1 that I just actually quoted, I want to really get it in our minds again to sort of frame how we're going to start this. But it's time for justice to roll down like waters and righteousness to flow like an ever-flowing stream, the scripture text that we know so well. And Thomas says that King stood in this prophetic stream, insisting that a nation that tramples the poor and hoards privilege will face judgment unless it changes its policies and practices. That is a powerful stance to claim for a country who at the time period was very comfortable with the idea that the disenfranchised could stay disenfranchised, that there would be those who would stay disenfranchised. And it's not just black, white, it's poor. It's poor, it's privileged, it's those who have and those who don't have. Even the Poor People's Campaign, King did a reverse westward expansion, went out to the west and started with the Chicanos and the Mexicanos and gathered them all up to say, how can we speak this true message of the Poor People's Campaign to talk just about this, that unless we address the poor that are being trampled and those who are hoarding privilege, that there's no way that we can have justice. So that's a very powerful reality, a lived reality of that. And then we have, of course, Martin Luther King in his speech on Washington, where he says, I've been to the mountaintop. But he's speaking also in that voice of Amos, where he's recognizing, it's almost as if he has this prophet as a light by which he is shining him a pathway for himself here. So in our source number 2, which is actually Dr. King himself from I've Been to the Mountaintop speech, somehow the preacher must be an Amos and say, when God speak, who can but prophesy? Again with Amos, let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. We had this phrase lately in our modern time period where we say that prophecy and being prophetic is speaking truth to power. That's only a part of it. It's speaking truth to power and to anyone else who will not listen to the truth. Because the truth needs to be spoken, especially from a prophet's mouth. It's inevitable that they're able to speak the truth, because that is the call, and that is the call of the prophet. When you say, who, me? The divine says, yes, you must speak this truth because it is the truth of the universe, of the cosmos. It is the truth of how we are to be with one another in the world. And that's why the preacher must be an Amos. That's what King was really aligning himself with, and why he was able to step even out of the tradition of his own father to move forward into another space that he didn't want to be in. We always have to remember that King did not want to be the spokesperson.
Yeah, like Moses.
Right. Like every prophet. I went through that in a Bible study a couple of months ago. I went through every prophet's call. and looked at the 6 signs where they all say, who, me? No, not me. I need a, and then there's a sign that comes in that says, okay, I'll finally go. But there are all these signs, and it's no different now in our time period. And there's one last source that I want to lift up here, which is source number 3 in your packet. And this is one by which most of us are mostly familiar. And I'm going to encourage you that when you read this in your packet and when you visit with this, say these words out loud, because I think it's really important, and I say this to our young people all the time. It's important that you know that you have the right to speak these words of power. You have the right to speak these words of the prophet and to name them as yours, so that when we say these words of King from his I Have a Dream speech in August 28, 1963, we say them with our voice, with our intention and our spirit. No, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. Note the idea of we're quoting the scripture, we're claiming the scripture, and then we're taking it and making it into what we are now in this way that King is speaking right now. And he's saying that, not until. But he also says, I am not unmindful that some of you have come here out of great trials and tribulations. Some of you have come fresh from narrow jail cells. Some of you have come from areas where your quest for freedom left you battered by storms of persecution and staggered by the winds of police brutality. You have been the veterans of creative suffering. Continue to work with the faith that unearned suffering is redemptive. And here I have to claim the power of womanist theology. It is not that suffering we hold as a valor. We hold suffering as holy because God is in it with us. And we claim that this unearned suffering is redemptive, not because we get to suffer and stand taller because we have suffered, which many of us have an opportunity to say, well, I've suffered, so I deserve something better. We suffer and we come through it and we stand through it in these streams of righteousness. And in womanism, it says that we claim that because the holy is with us. And the holy is preferential to those who suffer and are oppressed, to claim righteousness and to claim wholeness. And that's where there's a branch of that comes from the mothers in the African-American tradition that womanism in the 80s and the 90s sort of mentioned specifically, but has always been, there's been brought up by King's mother, by Coretta Scott King, by the women in his life as well. So I wanted to bring that in, that Amos is fleshed out by the voice of the mothers as well, who bring these and whisper these words into their children's ears as they're going through the suffering as well.
Thank you. Wow. Thank you for this introduction. Again, we're framing today in the notion of prophets, ancient and modern. I want to bring one more contemporary prophet who walked alongside King to help us get from the big picture of King in the 20th, 21st century to the biblical history of where we come from. And the reason why prophets is how we're beginning this political course of a year-long exploration of our history and our healing. And so I want to share with you a very brief quote also from your source sheets that I hope you've all got the link to in the chat. This is source number 3, and this is Abraham Joshua Heschel of blessed memory, who also not only wrote extensively about the prophets, but walked the talk and literally prayed with his feet. So the short quote that I want to read from source number 3 for you is Heschel saying, "It is the prophets who teach us that the problem of living does not arise with the question of how to take care of the rascals, how to prevent delinquency or hideous crimes. The problem of living begins with the realization of how we all blunder in dealing with our fellow humans. The silent atrocities, the secret scandals, which no law can prevent, are the true seat of moral infection. The problem of living begins, in fact, in relation to our own selves, in the handling of our emotional functions and the way we deal with envy greed, and pride. And so I'm bringing this quote by Heschel alongside the teaching of King as a way to get us really deeply into what we're talking about, a historical chapter that I think some of you might know, some about and many of us don't. And I'm going to try and finagle both the sources on my Mac here and together here as we go through the history of Amos. Who was he? Who is he? Just for today, it'll be easier if you use the sheet that I linked for you to look through the sources. I'm not going to put all of them in the chat, but I'm going to walk us through for the next 20 minutes or so the history of Amos and the history of how we got here, the two kingdoms. We're going to have time for one more prophetess, and then at around 3:05 or so, we're going to stop. We're going to have a few more thoughts from Reverend Derrick, and then I'm going to ask you, those of you who want to stay online, for questions, for thoughts about this course, about what we're studying today, to stay on for more Q&A. And for those of you watching the recording later on, I know there's quite a few of you. I hope it is helpful to walk it all together. And when we meet again next month, we're going to get our tech a little better organized. So let's begin. The prophet Amos. He actually begins his prophecy in his book. He's one of the prophets in the prophet section with a historical connotation of who and where he is. And so I'm going to put those words in the chat for us as well, just to get us started. And give us the literary, poetic context of who he is, but also we do have specific history to let us understand why his words are timeless, but also very timely. So here's how it begins. Divrei Amos, אשר היה בנוקדים מתקוע, אשר חזה על ישראל בימי עוזיה מלך יהודה ובימי ירבעם בן יואש מלך ישראל, שנתיים לפני הרעש. These are the words of Amos, a sheep breeder, a cowboy from Tekoa. Where's Tekoa? Big questions. We'll figure that out in a moment. Who prophesied concerning Israel in the reigns of kings Uzziah of Judah, and Yerovam, son of Joash of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake. We know a little bit about the earthquake from other prophets who mentioned them. It did or did not leave a big impact on the livelihood of those people, but we know a little bit more about what it means to delineate those two kings. In other words, Amos is living at a very particular moment. And if you look at the next quote in your sheets, this is where justice as a mighty stream comes from. And before we look into his history, here's what he says. Hear this word that I intone as a dirge over you, O house of Israel. He's talking to the northern kingdom of Israel. We'll see why that matters. It's not just a euphemism for all of Jewry. God says, I loathe, I spurn your festivals, your pilgrimages. I'm not appeased by your solemn assemblies. If you offer me burnt offerings or your grain offerings, I will not accept them. I will pay no heed to your gift of fatlings. Spare me the sound of your hymns. It's tough to say this in this church where we just sang, right? Spare me the sound of your hymns. Let me not hear the music of your lutes, but let justice well up like water, righteousness like an unfailing stream. Vayagil kamayim mishpat utzedakah kenachal eitan. This is Amos talking to the religious bureaucracy of his day. He's talking to the corruption of power, which is in the palace and in the temple together, and says then now religious bureaucracy, when it is aligned with state power, is not what we need, is not the force, is not the power of spirit. It's the corruption of spirit. So who is Amos? Where and how is this man still a voice that we listen to today? I'm going to put in the chat source number 6 that gives you a little more information, just a tid, so we understand the context of the political history and the map that I'm looking at. And if you look in your source sheets, you will see the actual maps that will help us make sense of this history. Amos. We are in the roughly years of 760 to 755 BCE. We're in the 8th century BCE, and he is living during the times of two different kings. It's important to understand, and this is an introduction to what we will do all year long, that there were these two parallel kingdoms, and they had different royal houses. King David is the famous one. King David is one we're going to revisit, and he is the one who became famous because he represents Judah, the south. And the house of David, from David all the way through his descendants, was the through line of the kingdom of Judah. A single dynasty lasted, the house of David. Meanwhile, on the north, there were several royal dynasties, and there were coups and there were rebellions. Different royal houses took over. The most famous among them is the house of Omri, or the house of Ahab, whom you probably heard of, Queen Jezebel. That is part of that dynasty. Jezebel is maligned, and Omri and Ahab are maligned because it was the south, the house of David, who wrote the book. But actually, both those dynasties have a lot to tell us about our history. So the specific time when the book of Amos begins, and you don't know this history, I didn't know this history, you just gloss over, who cares, this king, that king, blah, blah, blah. No, this is a very important thing. Imagine that you would be reading the history of this time, and you will be saying, this is the time of the second presidency of he who shall not be named. Okay, I know where we are in the world, right? The political mention here is really important. So Uzziah, the 10th king of the kingdom of Judah, is on the throne in the south. Further in the north, Jeroboam II is the 13th king of Israel. So you can see that these dynasties have been going on for a while. Now, it says that he is a shepherd or a cowboy. There are different ways of describing. He has a few different occupations, but he's probably a wealthy man who has a business, right? He's cowboy doesn't mean that he's a lone, rider on the horse. It means he's a man of means, meaning he's got a voice in the community. And then the question is, where is he from? So Tekoa today is about 10 kilometers out of Jerusalem. And it's a settlement, in fact, a hippie settlement, but settlement nevertheless. So it's assumed that it's always been there, and he's a Judean. He's from the south, because Jerusalem and the southern environs is definitely the very small kingdom of Judah. Meanwhile, the kingdom of Israel is to the north, and it's vast, and it's much more popular, and it's much more populated, and it's got ports and access to the north, and it's cosmopolitan and universal, while Judah is much more hilltop and secluded. So if he's from the south, he's from Tekoa in the south, which is where most people think it is, then he is a Judean talking truth to power to the Israelites, right? You're not going to need some guy from New Jersey telling you how to run Manhattan. It's a bad example. You're not going to use somebody from the south talking about the north, unless Tekoa is actually in the north, which it might be, in which case Amos is a northerner talking truth to power to the northerners, which is the biggest empire. That makes sense. Why is his book recorded? But later on, when the Judeans get to write the book, they make sure that he speaks not just to the northerners, but to the southerners. We'll get to that in a moment. But I just want you to understand, when we read the prophets at the synagogue, at Haftarah, many of us here, I know, are scholars, it's important to listen to what is being told here. We're getting a historical marker. This king, that king, those dynasties are not getting along. Each of those kings has his own fascinating biography. We won't get into that right now. And we know where we are approximately because of the earthquake that would change some of the realities on the ground. So that's just a bit of a historical map. The 8th century BCE is important. It is right in the middle of the 200 years of the parallel lives of those two kingdoms. And when we look in the sessions coming up at the history of the divided kingdom, the biggest question is, and I'll give a little teaser there, was there a united kingdom? In other words, according to the Bible, the confederacy of tribes somehow settled in Canaan. Maybe there was an exodus, maybe there wasn't. The scholars are in debate about that. But at some point, the confederacy of tribes wants a king. And Saul becomes the first king. He is the king from the tribe of Benjamin. That is a tribe in the north. And Benjamin, under Saul's leadership, becomes the most important tribe. And the tribes kind of begin working and create a confederacy. But then this guy from the south shows up, an upstart, David. Judah is a tribe in the south, a tribe of herdsmen. It is not the opulent, wealthy, and important tribes of the north. And through some kind of a transition, the south takes over the north. David takes over Saul. Judah replaces Benjamin, and the house of David takes over. It becomes an empire. His son Solomon takes over, builds the temple. But as soon as Solomon dies, 2 kings only on the throne, the big kingdom of Israel, Judah, splits into 2. David's grandson, Rehoboam, is unable to contain this vast empire, and so it splits to north and south. And for the next 200 plus years, those are 2 separate kingdoms. That's the official story. That is how the Bible is written, and that is what we've been told. But for the last 100 years or so, historians, archaeologists, scholars are like, wait a minute. Was there ever a united kingdom, or were we split from the beginning? Were we born divided? And the story of the United Kingdom under David and Solomon is a later attempt by the scribes from the Judean side, from the south, to depict the story as Judean supremacy and northern resistance. It makes a difference, because what we were born as and how we developed as 2 very different ideologies, insular, open, tribal, global, particular, universal, centralized, non-centralized, makes a big difference. And so David versus Saul, south versus north, Amos living at a moment where 2 different kings live alongside each other, 2 neighboring nations with maybe the same God, maybe the same language, and a lot of shared economy, but not the same kingdoms. Amos is talking to both, as many of the prophets are. And while there's a border between them, it's very porous. And that sometimes the civil war is armed, and at other times it's just using words. But there's definitely a distinction between south and north. And Amos is giving us just a glimpse of what those differences are. Because of time, I'm not going to go deeply into the story of Amos's prophecies, but I do want to share with you an academic source about what does it mean for the words of Amos to live in our history, and what does it tell us about the South and the North. I apologize that today it's going to be a little hard for me to open up the Zoom for questions through your voices. If there are questions you want to share in the Zoom chat, please do, and I'll refer to them now, or stick around till the end of the session at around 3 in about 25 minutes, and stick around. It will be easier to do more Q&A. But I want to make sure that you get the big picture here, right? Amos is just one guy,
Right.
Just one prophet, maybe a cowboy, maybe a rich herdsman. His words are strong towards Samaria, which is the capital of the north, and towards the kingdom of Israel, the wealthy kingdom of Israel. But the Bible doesn't get written till way later. And it's important to remember one more date, one more fact before I read this next text with you. One second, let me let one more person in. And that is that the nation of the north and the nation of the south coexisted on parallel lives with a lot of tensions and sometimes relationships until 2 things happened. In the year 722 BCE, not terribly long after Amos, the Assyrian Empire, that is the first big empire of the Near East, decides to bulldoze its way through what is now Israel, or the northern kingdom of Israel, towards Egypt, towards Gaza, where you actually have a commerce, free commerce line from north to south, right? The Levant, what is now Israel, Palestine, what's been this terrain for all those years, was always smack in the middle of commerce. Yes, it's the Holy Land, but really it's about a corridor that connects some of the south to some of the north. The Assyrians, who were a brutal, big empire from what is now Iraq and Iran and Turkey, grew out of that Mesopotamian tradition and built a very fierce empire. And they wanted the trade route. And so they had the eye on the very wealthy kingdom of Israel, with its palace in Samaria, with its temples everywhere, not just one temple, multiple temples, it's important. And they, in the year 722, after a long campaign, level the palace in Samaria, and exile many of what we now refer to as the lost 10 tribes. Now, there's a lot of talk about who the lost 10 tribes are. On just a few blocks from here, on 125th Street, was this whole Hebrew Israelite tradition of who the 12 tribes are, etc. Chances are that many of the 10 tribes of the nation, the kingdom of Israel, did not get exiled to the far reaches of the Assyrian Empire, but simply moved to the south, to Judea, to the areas around Jerusalem, Hebron, and Beersheba. We know that from archaeology. Some were exiled, but the northern kingdom, as we know it, ceased to exist in the year 722 BCE. The destruction of Israel, the destruction of Samaria, the exile of the first large kingdom was a huge trauma for the region. But somebody benefited, the smaller kingdom to the south, the kingdom of Judah, with its capital in Jerusalem, with its temple in Jerusalem, with its much smaller population, suddenly had a huge population boost, received all the intelligentsia, the intellectual input from the people of the north, including their scribes and their scriptures, their stories, their traditions, their wealth. And so Judah suddenly grows. The southern kingdom begins to grow. It incorporates some of the traditions of the north. There are some tensions, but there are some integrations. And we know for like 150 years, from 722 until 578, 568 BCE, Judah prospers, and writing prospers, and the traditions that will become the Bible prosper. There are many prophets along the way. The last among them is Jeremiah, and one more prophet who we're going to meet in a moment. Her name is Huldah, the last prophetess of Jerusalem. But while Jerusalem trudges on throughout the 8th, 7th, 6th century BCE towards its destruction, when the Babylonians replace the Assyrians as the next empire, the Babylonians want the same thing. They want a corridor of trade that gives them access through Egypt from south to north. And now Israel is gone. It's been leveled. They've taken all the people and depopulated them, and now they want Judah. So Judah and Jerusalem and the last king of the house of David will fall because of the Babylonian conquest. And now off they go to Babylon, and there is an exile at this point. Many people leave. But in response to the destruction of both north and south, the Bible gets written. The Bible gets written as a text that says we don't need geography. We've got texts. We might not have Jerusalem or Samaria. We might not have sovereignty over this land, but our texts are going to give us something to hold on to. And so the Bible gets written as a response to trauma, and it gets written by Judah, by the south. I'm going to come back to this again and again. Imagine that the only history you know about the United States Civil War is from the Confederacy. Imagine that the only piece of news you've ever read about the Civil War and its aftermath is through those who are in the South. They don't like the Yankees, and they don't love the North, and they might be anti-abolition. So how do you tell the Civil War from that point of view? Now, whether you watch Fox TV or BBC, Al Jazeera or CNBC, right? These channels make a big difference. Understand that the Bible, the Tanakh, was written from the point of view of the South with an agenda on the North. And so what we're going to do here is going to read through and say, oh, I'm hearing the North, I'm seeing the North, I'm understanding that there are other agendas here that are not those of the editors. And those South-North narratives are going to help us understand the bigger picture of who we were and who we are and who we will be. And Amos the prophet is one of those voices from the North who then gets co-opted by the South. Why? Let's read the next text. And if this feels very historical, take a deep breath. I hope this all makes sense, and there'll be time for Q&A later. This is just the first of our year-long journeys. Look at source number 7. I'm not going to put it in the chat. I'm just going to read it from the sheet. This is from a longer article by Israel Finkelstein to give us a sense of the Israel-Northern debate, and then source number 8 about Amos himself. Israel Finkelstein is an archaeologist, current day Israeli, and has done a lot to help us understand what's at stake for the northern-southern story through archaeology. One kingdom the kingdom of Israel was born in the fertile valleys and rolling hills of northern Israel and grew to be among the richest, most cosmopolitan, and most powerful in the region. Today, it is almost totally forgotten, except for the villainous role it plays in the biblical books of Kings. The other kingdom, the kingdom of Judah, arose in the rocky, inhospitable southern hill country. It survived by maintaining its isolation and fierce devotion to its temple and royal dynasty. These two kingdoms represent two sides of ancient Israel's experience, two quite different societies with different attitudes and national identities. Right? So this is where we come from, south and north. And again, the south got to write the text. We're going to go into the subtext. Now let's look at this example of the south-north through the character of Amos, or Amos, as they like to call him here. Okay, so look at source number 8. This is from a literary, a recent study by Professor Jason Radin, who's a contemporary historian and biblical scholar. I'm going to read through it and explain it because I think it's going to help us make sense of it before we look at one last prophetess. The book of Amos is not prophecy per se, but rather is a literary predictive text, a text written as a prophecy to explain a historical development in terms of divine will. The book is thus both an indictment and an autopsy of fallen Israel, part of the general biblical understanding of Israel's catastrophes as being due to the Israelites' own religious and moral failures. In other words, Amos is written after the kingdom of Israel no longer survived. Now, you can say that the kingdom of Israel ceased to exist because they were greedy, because they were overweight with their own wealth and didn't take care of the poor, because they were blind to the moral and to the religious callings of the prophets. Perhaps. You can also say it's politics. The Assyrians want to weigh in. It's God or it's not God. The Bible has a way of telling the story as a moralistic and religious lesson through the story of the prophets, whether they existed exactly like they did or didn't. Here's what he says next. The intended audience of the book of Amos, and by the way, Amos is the first prophet whose words are written down, because at that point, around the 8th century BCE, literacy becomes very popular. We're moving from the oral tradition to the written tradition. And the pinnacle of that is, of course, is going to be the writing of the Bible 100 years later. So Amos is already written down. Somebody is writing it down. The intended audience of the book would have been the people of Judah in the aftermath of the Assyrian conquest of Israel. In other words, people in Judah at this point are a combination of Israelite refugees and the native Judite population. Judah and Israel, neighbors, but not the same kingdom, not the same people. The book presents to the refugee component of the audience a Judahite perspective on their role in their own fall, as well as an indication of what is morally expected of them in Judah. To the Judahite audience, the book declares that while wealthier Israel might have seemed favored by Yahweh, Judah is in fact now favored. The north failed, the south prevails. That means we're better. That is the agenda, the agency of the authors. At the same time, Judah remains vulnerable to suffering and to destruction, as we will see, because Israel's fate of its people if they don't learn from Israel's experience. The book's searing indictment of the kingdom of Israel probably came from resentment at Israel's relative success compared with its southern neighbor, Judah. Israel was always wealthier than Judah, but its wealth is presented in this book and others as its own undoing. Israel suffered the fate it deserved in the book's view. Such an accounting of catastrophe both defended Yahweh from blame for not protecting Israel and at the same time empowered ancient Jews by asserting that they could control their future by their own behavior. So that is Amos. Okay, when the 8th century BCE, he is or isn't prophesying to the north, from the south to the north. By the time the book is written, it is used by the southern editors to say the northern kingdom collapsed because of greed and the southern kingdom will have to watch out, or that too will end. And the prophets, therefore, end up being the post factum holders of the warning. If you don't stick to justice, you will collapse, which is exactly what happens. I'm leaving Amos behind for a moment, okay? He is in the 8th century BCE. There's a king in Judah. There's a king in Israel. The kingdom is going to prosper for another 70 years or so in the north and for another 150 years or so in the south. But then that kingdom is going to come to an end as well. And there's one more prophet whose name I want to mention. We're not going to get deeply into her story today, but it's important for us to know her. Fast forward, Amos, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Hosea, all these guys, and you might be asking, where are the mamas? Where are the prophetesses? Where are the women to hold us through the moments of darkness? And so we know that there were wise women and women who were seers, witches, medicine women, and a few women who were defined as a prophet. This is patriarchy, and it's a man's game written by men, but the power of some of these women could not be avoided. Right. The most important one among them is the last one of Jerusalem. Her name is Huldah the prophet. So if you look on your sheets, we're on page 4. There is there's a far too small chart of the lineage of kings. We'll come back to that at a future session. But source number 9 is a lengthy text that describes the beginning of the end of the house of David, the beginning of the end of the kingdom of Judah in the year 568 BCE. This is the decade leading to it. We're in the book of Kings 22. I'll give you the very quick synopsis, and then we're going to look at one brief text about this prophet named Huldah. There's a king on the throne. His name is Josiah. He was put on the throne as an 8-year-old boy. There's a lot of religious coups and the people who want the tradition to stay on. So he's a bit of a puppet, and he grows until he's 18 years old, and then he begins the great reforms. Under the Judean mindset and the priests that helped him, they are fighting idolatry. They don't want the goddess Asherah, the great goddess of Israel, imported from the north. They don't want her there. They cut down the sacred trees of the goddess. They probably execute many of the priests and priestesses who worship the different deities of the land. They centralize Jerusalem and the temple of Jerusalem, and they declare that Yahweh is the only God, which to those people would have been like, what are you talking about? There's lots of gods. Ours is awesome, but he's not the only one. But Josiah's reform is a major theological reform. And then something happens. They begin fixing up the old temple, Solomon's temple. It's his great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. It needs repair. And while they're repairing, somebody finds a book, a scroll, inside one of the, hidden crevices. And they come to him and they say, we found this book, this scroll in ancient Hebrew. And they read it to him. Shaphan, the scribe, is an important guy, reads it to the king. The king rips his clothes and starts to cry and weep and says, these are the words of the ancient prophets that are warning us that if we don't worship one God in one place and do these things, we're all screwed. Everybody, we need to change everything, topple down the temples of the other gods, and let's all repent. But before he does that, he says, I need validation that this scroll, this book is actually legit. And so he says, go find out from the most important authority, can we trust this book? And where do they go? They go to the prophetess of Jerusalem, the last one. Her name is Huldah. We don't know much about her. Her husband's profession and lineage is mentioned. Hers is not. She's mentioned in a few other places in the Bible, but she basically looks at the scroll that they either found and most likely wrote, according to most scholars, and she says, this is real. This is legit. And you got to tell the king, you got a lot of work to do to clean this mess up. And this won't be punished. You won't be punished for the crimes of your ancestors and for all this idolatry and the lack of justice. You're going to die okay, but your descendants will not. That ends up not being true either. He does die in battle shortly after. But Huldah, the priestess, the prophet, the wise woman, is the last woman in our text to give credence to the text that will become either the Bible or at least the book of Deuteronomy. right? Which is why the Deuteronomist, the one who wrote the book of Dvarim, the fifth book of the five of Moses, which is the most strict, which is where we get the most Judean principles. I'll give you one. I'm sitting in a church right now in Harlem. It is one of hundreds of churches in this borough, right? Thousands in the city, millions in the world. Is this church more holy than any other church? It is to the people of St. James, but it is not inherently more holy than any other temple, as are the synagogues, mosques, ashrams, etc. The Jerusalem temple, Josiah's reform says there's only one place on the planet where God lives, and that's Jerusalem. None of the other temples are legitimate. We are delegitimizing sacred worship in Israel or Judah or anywhere else. One place, one temple, Jerusalem. And guess why? Because that's where the power now resides, and that's where the taxes go. Centralizing religion as a political and spiritual act is an invention of the Judeans. The Northerners worshipped God in her, it, they, his forms under every tree. It was decentralized. So we now think about it as like, no, there's got to be one temple, one pilgrimage site, but actually, no, there isn't. That kind of authority is very political. What if there was? Every church and every mountain was holy, and the Holy Land was the place for everyone, and not just me versus you. See where I'm going with this? Once you start saying either or, you get into authoritarian, separatist, binary, supremacist thinking. And so Josiah's reform has to do with the birth of that Judean sensibility that would take over the previous sensibilities. And Huldah the prophetess, whether she existed or not, is used by the Judean scribes as the voice that says this is legitimate, which she may have been. We don't know. There's enough evidence that there are steps remembered for her, and her voices in other places. I want to share one more short text about Huldah with you before we wrap this up and open up for question. If you go to source number 11 on your sheets, next to a inspired European depiction of Huldah's voluptuousness. This is from Claudia Wikamp, who's a feminist biblical scholar and a very interesting critical thinker about the biblical texts. And Claudia says the following: Huldah's story is notable in the biblical tradition in that her prophetic words of judgment, right, she's saying this is a legitimate text, are centered on a written document. She authorizes what will become the core of Scripture for Judaism and Christianity. Her validation of a text thus stands as the first recognizable act in the long process of canon formation. Huldah authenticates a document as being God's word, thereby affording it the sanctity required for establishing a text as authoritative or canonical. And that's how the Bible moves from being a bunch of traditions and a bunch of stories from the north, from the south, with conflicting narratives. We're going to see that in the future. The Exodus from Egypt, that is a northern story. Moses is the hero of the north. The southerners, Judeans, they had no record of the Exodus. They don't care about Moses. Abraham is their hero. Aaron is their hero. Eventually, the Exodus will become part of the Bible, but not originally. Right. Two different stories. In the original story, Abraham and Jacob are not related. Jacob is the hero of the north, Abraham of the south. The authors will make them to one big family. So Huldah, who's living just before the end of the Judean kingdom in the, just before 568 BCE, is the last Torah that says there is a book, and the book is going to replace the temple, because the book is mobile, and a temple is not. Right. We're going to move from space to time, from temple to text, but not yet. I wanted to bring Huldah here and Amos here as just two of the prophetic voices that have left us a legacy that we're often not aware of, that is at the core of this ancient divide between North and South that we're still living today, which we will revisit. And it's not just a question of central or decentral, feminist or non-feminist. It's deeply two ideologies that are and are not on the same page. I want to direct your attention to source number 12. Give yourself the pleasure of 10 minutes of reading this later. Rabbi Arthur Waskow, of blessed memory, an important Jewish teacher who just passed and a teacher of mine, wrote this whimsical midrash, his creative commentary in the first person of Huldah, as someone who was in the temple infrastructure and in the court and in the palace, and rewrites history. So I just wanted you to look at it and read it later. I'm sorry we don't have the time to read it now. May his creative genius be a blessing. This was published at Lilith Magazine, and the link for the full piece is in your document. And finally, I'm going to skip one more source and go straight to source number 14, with which we will end today. Take any feedback or thoughts from you, and then open it to your questions and thoughts, which will be our format for like an hour of learning and then a half hour of Q&A. If you look at source number 14, this is from another biblical expert, Beth Alpert Nakal, who writes about the North and the South, and she writes the following: profound ties bound the two nations together. Their story, united and divided, is told in the language and ideology of Judah, meaning that as the Deuteronomistic authors conceptualized and transmitted the history of the northern nation of Israel, they excoriated most of Israel's king and virtually all expressions of Israel's religious practice and belief. Yet in doing so, these authors affirmed ties that bound the two nations together. The Deuteronomists, who are the Judeans who finally edited the Bible, could have dismissed Israel as they dismissed Judah's many non-Yahwistic neighbors. Their decision not to do so can be attributed to their acknowledgement of Israel's fundamental Yahwism, their powerful prophets, their revered ancestral traditions, their valued clan affiliations, and more. What remains singularly important is that despite the reality of separateness, the bond between these two divided nations became a critically important component of the Hebrew Bible. The depictions of this bond are so convincing that even today their imagery colors our reconstruction of the biblical past. So born divided and hidden, we are still uniquely different voices. And the question is, how do we honor these differences? And can we achieve some kind of a common ground that helps us today get beyond the deep, deep divides that unite us and divide us between Zionism and diasporism, centralism and decentralism, being a literal reading of Bible or a liberal reading of Bible, allowing the modern values of human rights and justice to be as equal as the ones we inherited, or stick to the old either or borders. These are new questions, but they're actually ancient questions. And that from the core of the biblical being, before it even became a book, these questions, these ideologies, are at the core of it. And the prophets were often the ones to name it, to take truth to its next important place of power. I'm going to end with a very short quote that I wrote some years ago when I began exploring this. This is source 13. There have always been and there will always be brave prophets who speak unpopular truths to power, calling their people to recalculate. Throughout the Bible, known and unknown prophets tried, often in vain, to change minds, to change the course of history for better. They cried out, some paid the price, some silenced, yet the words still show up on our signs and in our sermons today. Prophetic poetry, love-driven laments, protests powered by the passion of rage. A rebuke meant to repent, to admit what's wrong, and to repair, to wake us up. Today we need the voices of the prophets, ancient and new, the ones whose words wail that cruel conflicts and wars must end, that morality must be restored. Protest isn't only for prophets, it's on all of us. Ordinary people daring to care and risk and raise our voices for justice, not as traitors, but as truth tellers on the mission of repair. And when we falter, fear, forget, the prophets still among us remind us to fear less, love more. Amen.
Amen.
And so with that, friends, I'm going to take a breath. Thank you for joining me on this tour de force of Amos to Huldah, that king, to this king, the northern kingdom, the southern kingdom. If some of this feels confusing, fear not. We're going to get deeper into this. I'm going to send some more posts and essays and writings. We're going to make sense of this throughout the year, and I'm hoping that this will help us chart our way through a roadmap of redemption. I'm going to invite my friend here to give a couple of comments or closing, and then I'm going to invite you all to stay on, if you would like, for until 3:30 for the next 25 minutes for questions about what we've just studied, for thoughts, for reflections. If you need to walk off, please do so. And if you're watching this later at home, I hope this is illuminating and inviting. Our next session is going to be in February. This one is free for everyone. Starting with the next one, I invite you to become a paid subscriber. There's a sliding scale that makes it affordable for a year long so that I can actually pay a tech person to be on, to be reliable, and to help with some of the research. So your support goes a long way to make that possible. Thank you. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to my brother to help us close as you helped us open.
I just have pretty much only one sort of major point that's been roaming through my head and forming as you've been speaking. It is so important for us to understand this conversation of what you're talking about with demystifying whose voice gets to tell the story. It is I've been thinking about empire and domination and how the stories are told and how the texts are used. And it's not the texts themselves in terms of their religiosity, but the strategy behind the text. The inevitability that you mentioned from the Judean prospect of understanding that if you don't do what we're saying, you're going to suffer.
Well, canceled and then
Or
suffer,
canceled,
right?
well, canceled and then suffer. But it's that whole idea of the inevitability of that is taken up by every single empire afterwards for every colonial exploitation.
Right.
It's like you have not followed through with what you've been called to, so therefore
We take over.
we take over. And it, especially when I'm studying in the First Testament, the first century text for Christianity, this is why the Romans translated the Torah into Greek. That's why they translated the First Testament into Greek with the Septuagint, is because they wanted to tell their colonialists that your scriptures are telling you, and we're holding your scriptures sacrosanct to say, this is why we are dominant over you. And it's one of those things that gets replayed and replayed throughout text, throughout history, and it's one of those strategic points, strategic political points that people in power tend to use, is that inevitability of your failure because of what you've done and what you haven't done that you claim is your righteousness. And so we get caught up in this notion of accepting that inevitability, and also sometimes the idea that we get caught up in the idea that we cannot move through this oppression and this suffering because it's inevitable. But when we look at this very clearly and see how it's constructed, we get to see that suffering is not inevitable, that hope is real, that justice is real, that courageousness is real, that speaking truth to what is happening is real and can make a difference and can change things, and that it is not inevitable that we constantly look at ourselves as that fatalistic failure of people because we are doing something wrong. That has been told to us, if you're not following this, this is what's going to happen to you. Right. And that's a really strategic political point that is being lifted up from thousands of years ago for this moment here today. That's my initial take on how I'm seeing the thread move through the text that we've studied, the non-canonical text that I studied that happened after the canon was put and all those other things were thrown out. It's that through line. And what gets thrown out is when people refuse that fatalistic inevitability.
Yeah.
So I throw it away and claim it.
Thank you.
I claim hope as well.
Yeah. I think what's important about that is that, again, we're looking at the American story right now, right? You've got whatever, a president that is going to like retell the story of what is value in a religious system that is silencing the previous traditions, whether they are African American, indigenous to this country, whether they're liberal. We're seeing how one regime silences the ones that came before them or at the same time, right? And that delegitimization, I'm thinking about very much in the Jewish and Israeli context, but this is absolutely what we're doing with this country right now.
It's the world, yeah.
So let's pause here for a second. I am going to assume some of you might have questions, thoughts, reflections. I am going to invite you, let's see if I can know how to do this, I think I can, to raise your hand or just unmute yourselves when you want to ask a question. Let me remind you, a question has a question mark at the end. And if you want to make a comment, that is also totally legitimate. I'm going to prioritize questions first. For those of you watching this at home after, not as a live, and if you have questions, you are more than invited to write in and to send us your comments. So let me invite some people. Evelyn, please unmute. I think I can do this here. Can I?
Thank you, Rabbi Amichai and
Evelyn, we're hearing you.
And Reverend
I
McQueen.
think we are. Hold on.
It was great. It was terrific. One thing I was
Evelyn,
reflecting.
I think you need to
Can you hear
unmute.
me? No, I'm
hear her.
unmuted.
Should we be
We can
able
hear
to
her.
hear?
Can you hear me?
We can now.
Okay. I'm thinking of the tribe of Benjamin that might be able to give us some insight into understanding the relationship between the North and the South, because as you said, that that Saul came from the tribe of Benjamin. So I'm thinking that maybe going forward, if we look at the tribe of Benjamin and being so small and being between the North and the South, maybe that can help us understand the tensions between the North and the South.
I love that. Hold on a second. Are you able to hear me? Yes? Okay. Evelyn, what's so interesting is that Benjamin is equally troubling as Judah, although maybe better. Benjamin was a tribe with a lot of wealth, with a lot of agenda, with a history that is very specific. We don't know a lot of it because it is the northern history. It was written over by the south. So King Saul, who was the first king of Israel, we think, is maligned in the tradition. But he was the first king, and he does represent the very beginning of the confederacy of tribes, thinking, how do we do this as a shared union? So the property of Benjamin is right on the border between south and north, which is why Jerusalem was chosen. We're going to get to that 2 sessions from now. So I think in theory, reimagining the legacy of Benjamin might be helpful, but that's only in a very imagined and poetic way. I think it's safer to say that all those narratives have already been so tribally traumatized that what we need is something else. We need a mixing up of these old tribal narratives. We need the voice of Dinah, the 13th tribe, the woman leader whose voice we forgot. We need a neo-tribal identity beyond these stories. We need the third testament, right?
Yes.
We had the first, the Old Testament, the New Testament. We need the New Testament that is taking all of this and putting it in the blender together. So the Benjamin Judah story is fascinating, right? And the more you probe into these things, there's so many metaphors. I'm seeing Emmet putting beautifully in the chat, Mordechai, right? Mordechai, the Judean, is the first one to be called Yehudi of the people of Judah in our scripture, and he's Esther's whatever uncle, and he represents a particular Judean way of being in the world in diaspora, but he's definitely a descendant of Benjamin, because it says so. So what is it about that particular story of Mordechai and Purim and upside down, which already blends into a biblical mythic character, the Saul, the Saul, David, South, North, Judean, Benjaminite thing, and then it has to do with the Amalekites. There's much more there. I'm also just warning us ahead of time that I've sort of put 12 months on the calendar and 12 60 to 90 minute sessions and more essays along the time. We're not going to get to all of it, the South-North thing. I'm hoping this year will open up more portals towards that question. And the Mordechai Benjamin story is a great one it's another rabbit hole to go down. So thank you. And Evelyn, I want to say, I know you're a peacemaker and you keep thinking about ways to create peace. So may the reimagining the tribal traditions help us reimagine a better future, including beyond Benjamin. Thank you for that great question. Others, and again, it's totally okay to say, can you just go back and explain blah, 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 because there's a lot of data here, and I recognize that, and I'm hoping we will slowly unravel through it, and it might be a little confusing, so that's okay as well. My Yiddish Schwester, Jean, I'm inviting you to please unmute as well.
I'm interested.
Second?
It's can you hear?
Yes.
Reverberating. You have to shut your sound off. Okay.
Are we able to hear you now?
Yeah.
Just
So I'm wondering about I'm wondering, can you hear me?
Yes.
Right. I'm wondering about how the history is of 80% of the people who never left Egypt, and the tribe of Reuben and Gad, and the half of Manassehs who never crossed the Jordan. And if we look at our world today, at people who consider themselves Jewish, and with many of what we consider, I hope, Jewish principles of peace and love and freedom and fighting for justice, who are not at all affiliated, and how does that blend into these Bible stories that we tell, and our religious high holiday traditions and all? I'm not sure it's not way more people who weren't there than were there.
I'm going to try to answer your question in two parts. First of all, there are certainly many narratives of our history, of our mythology, that we don't know. There is a midrash, there is a legend that only 1 out of 5 in Egypt left Egypt, meaning a lot of people left behind and became part of the Egyptian infrastructure. Then again, there are people who think the Exodus never happened. So we're dealing with a lot of folk traditions that at some point what the Bible says is not necessarily what happened. But for sure, many narratives did not survive to give us their mindset, their ideologies, their values, their traumas, and their hopes. What I'm finding exciting, what I'll be doing throughout this course, is digging up, retrieving, reclaiming the narratives we do have. And some of them are from the northern tribes, and some of them include Reuben and Manasseh and the others who stayed across the Jordan. Some of them are the ones who prefer to stay in the diaspora, whether that's Persia, Babylon, and not be part of the commonwealth of Judah that Ezra and Nehemiah rebuilt, right? There was an authorial agenda for which texts make it and which are hallowed and which are censored and which are never told. We can find some of that censored materials, A, in the Bible, B, in the extra biblical writings, right? I'm going to spend 2026 doing this, but then in 2027, saying this in the house of the Lord of St. James, may the Lord give me strength, we're going to read through the New Testament. And the New Testament is another chapter of the split between South and North. Jesus is a northerner. And he represents a type of Jewish thinking that is opposed to the Templar Judean mindset of the bureaucrats, of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. He represents something else. So by the time Jesus walks off, and by the time Paul takes Christianity as a Jew into another place, that is another chapter of the Judean, Israelite, northern-southern schism that we're still dealing with today in many ways, and there are others. So, Gene, that's a good question. We don't have all those narratives, but we do know that many of them existed, and as we patch together the Judean texts we did receive, the Bible that we got, the Talmud that we got, we are able to decipher some of those lesser-known narratives and the multiplicity of voices, but not all. We've certainly lost some. And creativity and imagination and poets and writers and artists are the ones who bring us back some of those right now. So this is going to be a reclamation project this year, future years. But we need to be modest and say we're not going to be able to retrieve it all. We can imagine a lot of it. So I hope that's helpful. We have time for a couple more questions, and I can see a question in the text from Nancy. Can you go back to the subject of when literacy spreads and the written word takes precedence over the oral? Fascinating. Yes, we're going to get to that as well in future sessions. But we know that, here we are now using Zoom, right? I didn't grow up with Zoom. I don't know about you guys, right? Many of us did not grow up with computers at all because we're a little older. But at some point, technology dictates how we live. And we know today that the Assyrian Empire in the 8th, 7th century BCE took the previous Sumerian writing skills and advanced it. So the Assyrian script becomes very popular in the Levant, and how to write becomes something that you can do. By the time the Babylonians and then the Persians come around, writing moves into scrolls made of papyrus. It's much cheaper. It's much more durable. It's easier to duplicate. It's easier to replicate. It's easier to produce. So writing becomes more pervasive, and it's not only the regal and the legal contexts that are using text, but more people are using it. And so the written traditions of scripture, of mythologies, of laws, and of folklore eventually begin to be more popular around the 7th, 6th, and definitely 5th century BCE. By the time we get to the 5th century BCE, around 450, after the destruction of Jerusalem, after the exile from Babylon, the return to Jerusalem, Ezra, who is an important character, we'll come back to him, produces the first official scroll of the Torah. And scholars will argue, did they write it? Did they invent it? Did they edit it? But the moment you're starting to have an actual written text that can be copied, authorized, canonized, then you're starting to have a religion based on the written text, not the spoken text. And then you create a yes and no, in, out, authorized, not authorized, etc. That is around the 5th century BCE. However, what Ezra also does, and those of you familiar with storytelling know why he's still my hero, even though he's a complicated character, he produces the program by which you're going to recite the text, you're going to hallow and honor the text, the canon, what will become the Bible, but you're going to translate it at the same time. You're going to speak back to it. You're going to create midrash, commentary, so that the written text and the spoken text, the literary and the oral, go hand in hand. So every generation gets to reinterpret the sacred text. He introduced that too. What we're seeing today is that in many traditions, Jewish, Muslim, Christian, other, the text has to be observed at the expense of its evolution, right? And therefore, whether it's abortions or gay rights, whether it was slavery at the time or the sanctity of the Holy Land, people are saying, but it's in the book. It's literally in the book. And the literal versus liberal, the liberal says, well, yeah, it's in the book, but the book keeps evolving. And so that too is a southern-northern divide on some level, right? So the transmission of text from oral to written is extremely important, and we're living in a time today when we can talk back to the text, we can decipher the layers. that's super important as well. Thank you for that question, Nancy. And I know we're opening a lot of Pandora boxes here too. Ken, I want to invite you to, if you're able to, please unmute and share. I know you were there very early today for the session, so I'm appreciating you. If
Thank
you
you.
want to unmute and share your question.
Yes, I believe I'm unmuted. Thank you, Reb Amichai and Reverend McQueen. Amichai, it was so wonderful to see you at our conference. And I would like to follow up, Reverend McQueen, with, excuse me, I'm just curious, could you expound a bit on how at least your tradition, not necessarily the whole of Christianity, views the concept of the North and the South divide and its implications, historical, philosophical, religious implications for Christianity, or at least the Christianity of which you are a practitioner, devotee in your stream of Christianity. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Interesting.
Yeah. Can we be heard now?
Yeah.
Okay. That's such a great question because
1 second.
that's such a great question because I've been really thinking about that very much as I've been thinking about this conversation, especially from my academic aspect of looking at the text and how the texts from the First Testament are proof texts for Christianity very often, especially the book of Matthew. And the book of Matthew is very much a Judean understanding of Christianity because Matthew aligns Jesus to the family of David. That's its entire prospect, is to speak to the Judeans about accepting the legitimacy of Jesus.
Who is from the house of David.
Right.
So
the whole basis of Christianity is based on this Judean model, and yet this culmination of the idea of who is the one that can bring these two separate people together, these two peoples together. That is David. Because David, sort of says that, well, David brings together the North and the South after all of this. So that sticks. And then Jesus is supposed to do the same thing. Mm-hmm. And then Paul takes it upon himself as a Jewish person to say, well, I'm going to do this to the Gentiles. So it's this model of saying, I have a definitive story, but my definitive story is one that is going to bring us all underneath one way of thinking. And I'm going to get you and convince you and persuade you to be in that one way of thinking. So that's really the power of the making negative the North, as you're talking about. And it's very, very, very prominent in the New Testament, in the Second Testament, I call it now, because it's Samaria specifically. There is a prejudice, an ethnic prejudice from the Judeans against the Samaritans. Mm-hmm. And who are
the Northerners.
Right, and I speak about that very clearly, but I never really can speak about it with this much power. That's why when we're talking about the quote-unquote story of the Good Samaritan, it's sort of like this, who are you talking about, the Good Samaritans? Right. And there's a tale about Jesus sort of telling a Samaritan woman, why am I going to bless you? I don't feed crumbs to the dogs. And then there's this whole reconciliation of that kind of ethnic bias and racism that is there. It's not race, but it's ethnicism but that plays out all throughout the whole New Testament in terms of the North and the South Kingdom. And still it plays out that the Judean is what rises to the top.
Correct.
So I'll be doing more and more of that in my Bible study recently. So I'm glad that you asked me that, Ken, because I'm seeing the interplay of that as they're really trying to figure out how to convince the Judeans. They're not worried about convincing the north of Israel and those who are from the north that Jesus is the Messiah. They're mostly convinced and convincing the Judeans that Jesus is in the Messiah tradition from using Isaiah and Jeremiah as well.
Fascinating.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
I will just end by saying that I'm no expert on this, and you are, but according to many of the traditions, the barefoot radical rabbi known as Yeshua, Jesus, is a product of the north. He's from Nazareth. That is the northern kingdom,
Right.
and that is those territorial ideologies. But remember how in the story he is born in Bethlehem? That's Judah, right? By the time the text gets written, it was important to locate him in the house of David and in the tradition
And Matthew
of
does
the
that.
South.
Matthew
right.
does that.
And that's a choice, and people are arguing about this. So, but we will get to that in 2027. But for now, we're going to pause. Paul Adam, I know you have your question up. I'm sorry we're not going to get to it. I do want to end on time. So please feel free to send me messages, emails. This was a bit of a rocky tech start to our year-long journey, but I'm so excited to be doing it and be doing it here and to be doing it with you all. Thank you for taking the time to joining us on this auspicious Sunday, honoring Dr. King's legacy, prophetic legacy, to not lose sight of liberation, 3,000 years and in the making. We're going to continue this through Substack. I'm going to send the video of this conversation and the study sheet with some more questions and thoughts. Another article is coming up in preparation for our February session. And please send in feedback, suggestions, and thoughts. And one last thing, thank you for your patience with our tech glitches. There's something going on with Substack back end with the membership, and we'll make sure that we're sending you all the information for that. And the last thing I want to say is that our February session is coming up. Just one second. It is going to be Sundays at 2 p.m. Eastern, so it's good for our friends on the West Coast and in Europe. We are on 222, February 22nd is our next one at the same time. So stay tuned. Friends, may we learn from each other how to be better at this thing called being. And thank you for your hospitality. Go in peace. To be
Peace to
continued,
everyone.
my friends.